In the summer of 1943, late July, Lieutenant Dan Daspit felt a genuine thrill as he stood in the control room of the submarine USS Place. This was his vessel's second combat patrol, and it seemed the ocean was finally ready to grant him a long-awaited triumph. For weeks, the crew had unsuccessfully hunted Japanese convoys, but at last, a thin plume of smoke appeared on the horizon. For an experienced submariner, this was a sure sign. Smoke meant engines, and engines meant a tanker, a major prize. And indeed, before them lay the massive Japanese tanker Tonemaru No. 3, one of the most valuable targets. The Place cautiously took up a firing position. Inside the submarine, there was complete silence, broken only by the occasional brief command from officers and the tense breathing of the sailors. Everyone understood that they were about to strike a target comparable in importance to an entire fleet. Auxiliary machinery hummed, like a predator's heart before a leap. On Daspit's command, the torpedo men fired 4 perfect shots. 4 steel killers, like ghosts, raced into the ocean's darkness, straight towards the tanker's vulnerable belly. Moments later, the sonar operator excitedly reported a hit. The torpedoes had struck the hull. Everyone froze, anticipating the deafening explosion that should have shaken the water and instantly transformed the Japanese giant into a blazing inferno. But nothing happened. No flash, no rupture. Only dull thuds against the steel hull and a ringing silence that sent a cold shiver through the submarine's bulkheads. Astonishment was etched on the sailors' faces. For hits, for precise strikes, and not a single explosion. It seemed inconceivable. Daspit clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white and ordered preparations for a new attack. The crew, disbelieving their eyes, frantically began readying the next salvo. No one yet suspected that ahead lay a series of events that would go down in history as one of the most mysterious and dramatic failures of the American submarine force. To understand why the Place's attack turned into such a farce, we need to go back a few years, to the time when a new torpedo was being developed in the offices of the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance. After World War I, the Americans already had the proven and reliable Mark X torpedo. It was a weapon, though not perfect, that worked flawlessly, like an old soldier accustomed to battle. However, by the early 1930s, the situation had changed. The world was rapidly approaching a new war. Ships were becoming faster, stronger, more powerful, and older models could no longer meet the new demands. In 1931, engineers began designing the new wonder torpedo, the Mark XIV. It was meant to be the pinnacle of naval weaponry. Longer, faster, with a more powerful warhead than anything that had existed before. But most importantly, at its heart was the secret Mark VI detonator, inspired by German magnetic minds of the 1920s. The idea seemed revolutionary. The torpedo was not simply meant to strike the side, but to pass under the ship's bottom and explode at its most vulnerable point, beneath the keel, where there was no armor. One successful detonation could break a giant in half. This technology was kept in strict secrecy. Ordinary sailors didn't know exactly how the new mechanism worked, and instructions were locked away in headquarters. The Bureau of Ordnance assured everyone. The Mark XIV was the future, a guarantee of victory, a weapon unparalleled. It all seemed brilliantly simple, but that brilliance turned into a problem. The new magnetic detonator proved temperamental, like a spoiled child. It reacted not only to the metal of ships, but also to the Earth's magnetic field itself. And considering the weapon was tested in one region, but had to be used in another, the difference in latitude negated all calculations. In some conditions, the torpedo exploded too early. In others, it remained silent altogether. And it was this very weapon that became the main armament of the American submarine fleet in the early years of the war. Admirals were convinced it was perfect, meaning only Mark XIVs should be fired. Submarines went on combat missions loaded with the latest torpedoes. Sailors believed they held the most powerful weapon against Japanese transports. And only in battle, as happened to Lieutenant Daspit, did the terrible truth emerge. When the moment of truth arrived, this wonder torpedo most often turned into a useless piece of iron, sinking into the abyss. The place had no intention of letting its prey escape. The Japanese tanker Tonin Maru No. 3 was too valuable to let go. After the first failed shots, Daspit ordered to stick to the target with all their might. The entire crew understood. They needed to repeat the attack, and this time, do everything perfectly. The torpedo men checked every mechanism, like surgeons before an operation. Torpedo tube ventilation, lubrication, actuators. Everything was meticulously inspected. There could be no mistakes. In the evening, the submarine returned to its position. Daspit coolly waited until the destroyer was in the correct sector and gave the firing command. 2 torpedoes launched from the tubes, and moments later, the tanker's hull shuddered. A muffled explosion shook the ocean, and a cloud of smoke rose from beneath the stern of the Japanese giant. Applause and shouts of joy erupted. Finally, the strike had found its mark. A fire broke out in the Tonin Maru's engine room. The vessel lost power. This was the first victory. But Daspit was not in a hurry to celebrate. He was an experienced officer and understood. The enemy was still afloat, and until it went to the bottom, the job wasn't finished. The place set a new course. The commander ordered the next salvo to be prepared. And this is where something began that turned into a real nightmare. First torpedo, a perfectly aimed launch, a precise 90-degree angle, a distance of just over 1,000 yards. The torpedo surged forward and struck the tanker's side precisely. And silence. No flash, no sound, only a white wake on the water. Daspit, clenching his teeth, ordered a reload. Second torpedo, the same scene, a hit, no explosion. The crew began to exchange glances, as if in a dream. The torpedo men swore everything was working correctly, but the weapon stubbornly refused to perform its role. A third torpedo went into the water and only raised a fountain of spray. A fourth hit the hull and again fell silent, as if it had simply nudged the steel and sunk. Sailors clutched their heads. Someone, unable to bear it, pounded the torpedo room wall in despair. Hour after hour, the place continued the attack, but the result was unchanged. Hits, no explosions. It was as if fate itself was mocking the submarine. By this point, the Japanese had already called for help, and the first alarm signals appeared on the radio. Enemy ships were heading to the battle site, and Dan Daspit's position was becoming critical. By morning, the submarine place had transformed from a hunter into a helpless observer. Lieutenant Dan Daspit, usually reserved and composed, now seethed with rage. He knew he had done everything right. Perfect distance, textbook attack angle, impeccable calculations. His crew worked like clockwork. But the submarine fleet's most crucial weapon proved to be a useless piece of metal. The Japanese tanker drifted, damaged but alive. Before the commander's eyes was a target that could have been finished off with 1, at most 2 torpedoes. Instead, a series of failures. Daspit ordered them to fire 1 torpedo at a time, to avoid wasting a full salvo. Each new attempt ended the same way, a hit on the hull and silence. The crew couldn't believe their eyes. Some sailors were already whispering about a curse. By noon, the Japanese had managed to send out a distress signal. The radio crackled. Sonar operators heard the approach of an enemy escort ship. Soon, the silhouette of a destroyer appeared in the distance. This was a death knell. The place was left with its last torpedoes, but what good were they if they didn't work? Daspit clenched his teeth until his lips turned white and ordered the release of the last 2 rounds. It was a desperate move, a gesture of anger and utter despair. But the result was the same. 1 torpedo missed, and the second hit the tanker's hull, but again failed to explode. At that moment, something inside everyone on board broke. The commander understood. The hunt is over. Instead of triumph, humiliation. Instead of victory, helplessness. He silently gave the order to dive and withdraw. The place slowly descended into the depths, while the Japanese tanker, heavily listing, remained afloat, awaiting assistance. In the control room, Daspit took out his logbook and, with a hand trembling not from fear but from fury, wrote a phrase that would later become legendary. "It is difficult for me to convince myself that I saw all this." The place returned to Pearl Harbor in oppressive silence. The crew, having endured incredible humiliation, said nothing. Everyone understood that they had fired 15 torpedoes, and only one had yielded any result. The others had become a laughingstock. No submariner could accept that their weapon was less reliable than an old rusty harpoon. Dan Daspit sat in his cabin, replaying each attack over and over. Angles, distance, speed, everything had been flawless. He knew perfectly well it wasn't the crew's mistake. The torpedo itself was to blame, and this realization only fueled his rage. When the place entered Pearl Harbor, the submarine was already expected. On the pier stood the new commander of the Pacific Submarine Force, Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood. He knew about the torpedo problems, but had until then considered them isolated incidents, attributing failures to inexperienced commanders or the stress of battle. Now, a living witness to the most ignominious failures stood before him. Daspit, usually composed, was literally boiling inside. His report was brief and cold. He meticulously described all 15 launches, one by one, and stated that 12 of them hit the target but failed to detonate. At the end of the report, he added a terse line, "I can hardly believe that I saw all this with my own eyes." Admiral Lockwood listened, his lips pressed together. He later confessed, "I expected a stream of curses directed at me, at the Bureau of Ordnance, at the Newport plant, at the entire supply system. But Daspit was so angry he couldn't even utter a single curse word." The last unused torpedo remaining in the boat was sent for inspection. The result astonished everyone. It was in perfect condition, without defects, with a working detonator. On paper, it was ready for battle. In reality, another deception. The place brought to Pearl Harbor not victory, but proof of a terrible truth. The American submarine fleet was armed with a weapon that more often failed than killed. The story of the place and Dan Daspit shocked Pearl Harbor, but the most terrible thing was that this was far from the first such incident. Even at the very beginning of the war, submarines returned one after another with complaints. Torpedoes ran deeper than the target, detonated too early, or didn't explode at all. One of the first signals came after the attack on Pearl Harbor, when the USS Seawolf, off the coast of the Philippines, fired 8 torpedoes at a Japanese transport. Only one hit the target and failed to detonate. Similar reports came in one after another, but at headquarters, they were blamed on inexperienced crews and battle nerves. On paper, the Mark 14 remained a wonder torpedo, capable of detonating under the keel, where a ship is particularly vulnerable. In reality, sailors saw perfectly aimed shots turn into meaningless pieces of metal, sinking into the depths. Of nearly 100 torpedoes fired in the first months of the war, only 3 sank their targets. It was a catastrophe that could not be ignored. Every new patrol turned into a gamble. Commanders painstakingly maneuvered their submarines into position, risking their crews' lives, attacking under escort fire, all for their weapons to hit the enemy's hull and simply sink. Submariners returned from patrols with empty victory logs and growing fury. For Daspit, his mission with the Tona Maru was the final straw. He spoke out vehemently about the issues, and Admiral Lockwood, for the first time, grasped the scale of the problem. But even then, some in command stubbornly continued to turn a blind eye. The Bureau of Ordnance believed the fault lay with the commanders and crews. "You don't know how to shoot," while submariners knew the truth. The problem was with the torpedoes themselves, and every day of delay cost more lives and more missed victories. By the mid-1930s, the U.S. Navy needed new torpedoes, and all attention was focused on the Mark 14. On paper, it was a marvel of engineering, faster than its predecessors, increased range, a warhead nearly twice as powerful. Its price matched its ambition. Each torpedo cost no less than $10,000, several times more expensive than a new car at the time. For that kind of money, admirals were convinced they were getting a perfect weapon. But reality proved otherwise. Production was slow. The Newport torpedo station, where they were manufactured, couldn't even meet half the planned output. Where the fleet demanded 50 torpedoes a day, in reality, they produced, at best, 20. As a result, a terrible shortage developed by the start of the war. Every munition was considered literally worth its weight in gold. And it was precisely because of this high cost that the worst thing happened. Actual combat trials were practically non-existent. The Bureau of Ordnance Leadership decided that spending expensive torpedoes on practice firing was an unacceptable luxury. Everything was limited to calculations and rare test ranges where torpedoes were fired at decommissioned targets. The Mark VI detonator, the system's main selling point, was tested only once. The results were contradictory. One torpedo passed under the target and didn't explode, while the second worked and sank a decommissioned submarine. Despite such questionable outcomes, the product was declared ready for service. In real combat conditions, another problem emerged. The warhead was designed to be more powerful, increasing the explosive charge to 680 pounds. This made the torpedo deadly, but also too heavy. The new weight caused it to run deeper than its design depth. Commanders watched their shots pass under the ship's hulls without causing damage. Sometimes, the torpedo even detonated too early, putting the submarine itself at risk. Yet, engineers knew about these problems. Technicians at the factories and officers at the test ranges wrote reports about torpedoes running too deep. But the Bureau of Ordnance refused to admit mistakes. Military officials stood their ground. The weapon is perfect. The submariners are to blame for not knowing how to shoot. It seemed the solution was simple. They needed to conduct extensive practical tests, fire dozens of torpedoes, gather data, and refine the design. But each Mark XIV was so expensive and produced so slowly that no one dared to use them for extra tests. Thus, a weapon was deployed that had not undergone full combat condition testing. And now, thousands of sailors found themselves in Dan Daspit's situation. They risked their lives, one of the most dangerous combat missions, and at the crucial moment, their weapon failed them. For many, this cost too much. Misses meant lost convoys, botched operations, and the sinking of Allied ships. So, the American fleet, possessing the latest submarines and experienced crews, found itself handcuffed by its own overconfidence and bureaucracy. When the first complaints about the Mark XIV torpedoes began to multiply, submariners expected the command to immediately launch an investigation. Instead, they received a response that shocked even the most experienced commanders. There are no problems with the torpedoes. You are mistaken. The Bureau of Ordnance believed that all misses were due to unskilled attacks or poor calculations. Reports of torpedoes hitting the hull and not exploding were dismissed as nervous imagination of the crew. Furthermore, submariners were subtly accused of covering up their own mistakes with non-existent equipment malfunctions. The situation bordered on the absurd. Commanders brought back photographs, debris, and even detonators recovered after a miss. But even this failed to convince the officials. Despite undeniable facts, officials continued to insist that the weapon worked flawlessly, and submariners were simply fighting incorrectly. Meanwhile, a real tragedy was unfolding on the front lines. Torpedoes ran deeper than the target, exploded prematurely, or remained silent after hitting. Submariners risked their lives, went into combat positions, and, at the decisive moment, found themselves completely helpless. Several large Japanese convoys managed to escape simply because American torpedoes, one after another, refused to explode. For the sailors, this was a devastating blow to morale. Imagine weeks hunting the enemy, maneuvering under the threat of depth charges, bringing your boat into a perfect position, and at the moment when the target is within your grasp, hearing only a dull thud and watching the torpedoes sink helplessly into the water. Among submariners, the phrase grew louder. Our main enemy isn't the Japanese, but our own weapon. And only Admiral Lockwood, upon receiving Dan Daspit's report, truly began to wonder. Perhaps the fault wasn't with the sailors after all, but with the torpedoes. When Admiral Charles Lockwood carefully listened to Dan Daspit's report and compared it with dozens of complaints from other commanders, he realized that things could not continue this way. The submarine fleet was paralyzed. Boats went to sea, risked their crews, found targets, attacked, and returned with nothing. America was expending resources and lives, while Japanese convoys continued to deliver fuel and supplies to their bases. Lockwood decided to take a step no one had dared before. He ordered his own tests, disregarding the Bureau of Ordnance's prohibitions. In a Hawaiian bay, an old decommissioned target ship was anchored, and a submarine was given the opportunity to fire torpedoes at a real target. The results stunned everyone. Out of several torpedoes fired, only one worked as it should. The others either hit the side and failed to explode or ran deeper than the hull. Now, no one could blame it on commander's errors. The evidence was clear. The Mark 14 torpedo was not fit for combat. Engineers began dissecting the design piece by piece. The first discovery was astonishing. The torpedoes actually ran 2 to 3 meters deeper than their calculated depth. This was because they were tested in laboratory pools and calm waters. But in the ocean, the real dynamics were completely different. The second blow to the Bureau of Ordnance's ego came from the Mark 6 detonator itself. It turned out to be overly sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field and behaved unpredictably at different latitudes. Where it should have detonated, it remained silent. And where it should have been silent, it exploded prematurely. After these tests, a long struggle with bureaucracy began. In Washington, resistance persisted. Admitting error meant acknowledging their own incompetence, but the facts were undeniable. Lockwood insisted on a complete overhaul. Submariners could no longer be hostages to faulty weapons. The use of the magnetic detonator was temporarily banned. Torpedoes were converted to conventional contact detonators, which activated upon direct impact with the hull. Yes, this reduced the elegance of the original idea, but it worked reliably. Simultaneously, engineers reinforced the torpedo casings, fixed the depth issue, and fine-tuned their balance. It was from this moment that a turning point in submarine warfare began. Now, American submarines went to sea and returned not with empty logs, but with real victories. Enemy convoys increasingly failed to reach their destinations, and Japanese commanders began to realize that their previous impunity had ended. Admiral Lockwood later recalled, "As soon as we got rid of all these imperfect magnetic detonators and went to simple contact ones, all the torpedo problems just seemed to disappear." And though this sounded bitter, for the price of these mistakes had already been paid in submariners' lives and lost opportunities, it was this decision that restored the fleet's combat effectiveness. Thus, the desperate protest of one Lieutenant Daspit and the persistence of Admiral Lockwood turned the tide. America finally had the weapon it should have had from the very beginning of the war. When the place returned to Pearl Harbor with its shameful result, the crew felt as if they had lost an entire battle. But it was precisely this patrol that went down in history, because it revealed the whole truth about the wonder torpedoes that had turned into a catastrophe for the American fleet. Lieutenant Dan Daspit, who dared to openly address the problem, became the voice of all submariners who had previously been forced to silently endure accusations of unskilled attacks. After the tests and reforms initiated by Admiral Lockwood, the Mark 14 torpedoes were finally perfected. They began to work as originally promised, exploding on impact, tearing open the hulls of Japanese ships, and sinking transports. Submariners regained confidence in their weapons, and commanders no longer felt helpless in battle. But too much had already been lost. Hundreds of fallen sailors, dozens of lost submarines, and thousands of tons of Japanese cargo that reached its destination only because the torpedoes failed. It was a reminder that no secrecy and no paper victories can replace real testing and practical application. Dan Daspit's story became a symbol of perseverance and professional honor. He proved that even one commander can challenge the system if he is willing to speak the truth. His patrol went into textbooks as an example that technical errors can sometimes be more dangerous than the enemy itself. The Mark 14 remains in history not only as a weapon, but also as a lesson. It showed that arrogance and bureaucracy can paralyze an entire fleet, and the price for such errors is measured in human lives. But at the same time, it was also a story of common sense prevailing, because when engineers and submariners got their way, it was the corrected Mark 14 that became one of the main tools in the destruction of Japanese shipping. And every time American torpedoes finally tore the enemy apart, submariners remembered the place's patrol and how their commander, Dan Daspit, beyond himself with frustration and fury, was the first to raise his voice against a weapon that proved worse than the enemy.